Mr. Wright.
Thank you, my lady.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming to help us, Lady Coffey.
Good morning.
So, Lady Coffey, you've provided a statement to the inquiry dated the 24th of October of this year, and the reference of that statement is INQ 000588238. And I'm going to ask you questions about your role as Secretary of State at the Department of Work and Pensions during the pandemic. I'm going to just set out for you, by way of overview, that the 9 broad areas that I would like to cover during your evidence, please, so you know the areas that we're going to turn to and the order in which we're going to deal with them. First, joint working, some questions about the relationship between your department at the time, the Department of Work and Pensions, and the Treasury. Second, to examine the Kickstart scheme and ask some questions about that. Third, Restart, which is another job support scheme. Fourth, statutory sick pay. A few questions about changes to eligibility, and then the rebate scheme that was introduced. Fifth, the overall Department for Work and Pensions strategy for supporting the economically vulnerable and alleviating hardship. Sixth, the decision to uplift universal and working tax credits. Seventh, issues of fraud and error related to easements that were applied to the application process. Eighth, some questions about the factoring in to decision making by the Department of Long COVID. And then finally, looking ahead, some questions about the future, recommendations drawing on your experiences during the pandemic. So that's quite a lot of ground to cover. We've got the morning and a session this afternoon. I'll try and move between topics around the breaks that are factored into the day. I'll also check in from time to time that you don't need a break because, as I say, there is a lot to cover. And I'll signpost when we're moving from one thing to another. So the aim in the first session this morning is to cover at least the first 3 of those topics and up to the break. So can I begin then with some questions about joint working, and principally by that I mean joint working between the Department of Work and Pensions and the Treasury. You have described in your statement, it's paragraph 17 and 18 of it, what you described there as a particularly close working between the department and the Treasury during the pandemic. And then you say in paragraph 18, we see there that the Chancellor and the Treasury were more generous and agile than the regular status quo. A couple of questions are arising from that. First of all, particularly close working relationship during the pandemic. Was that different to how the department worked alongside the Treasury in ordinary times?
Well, in business as usual, kind of normal speed, there's much more of a longer iterative process of how the two departments work together, particularly at official level. For example, the budget being prepared today for the current Chancellor, DWP officials would have been heavily involved and were at the time, in my time, of, for example, discussions with the OBR, trying to get things scored, and all of this is quite an iterative process. So what was needed, recognising the challenge, was much closer, much more rapid. There'd be email chains flying all over the place. But one of the things that I think we sought to do was to try and condense some of that. And at various points we talk about creating cells, so it'd be much closer discussions in order to be able to help with the decision making, rather than email chains that are hugely extensive. I mean, there was plenty of them anyway, but we tried to make sure that we were walking in step.
So would you say then it was a process that meant that decisions could be made much more quickly than they normally would be?
Yes.
And would you say that the relationship was more open than that usually is between the Treasury and other departments?
It's a good question about whether it was more open. I think what's fair to say, I'd arrived in September 2019, starting off as a new Secretary of State. It wasn't a general reshuffle. Somebody had resigned and I went into the role. We had a few things along the way. Then we had an election, come back really January 2020. So there was still quite a big learning period for me as well. But these things have been going on, general processes, budgets, spending reviews. So there was a regular pattern of that interaction between the two departments. But clearly this time we had to, due to the novel situation, we had to speed a lot of this up. So stuff that might have taken days or even weeks was taking potentially at times hours or a few days. So, but still rigorous in trying to make sure we could come up with good analysis.
Was decision making essentially more direct in that there would be a direct communication between either ministers or Secretary of State, Chancellor level?
No, it still tended to go. Special advisors would be involved, the back and forth. So my conversations directly with Rishi were actually quite limited in certain ways. Again, keeping effectively quite a formal process instead of an informal process. However, I'm just conscious, as I say, lots of people working very hard in that, particularly in that early time, to try and get rapid analysis back and forth. It's a classic way of how government works. Stuff gets commissioned. You don't always get told what the end game is. Sometimes, perhaps, and it'll be my reflections, give us the problem, not just what you think the solution should be. So we can think about that and avoid some nugatory work. But I think overall people were trying to genuinely make good, well-qualified decisions.
And so when you say more agile than normal, do you mean by that decisions were being made with more speed than was normally the case, and that there was a more free thinking going on about how a problem could be solved?
I think there was a bit more free thinking, and also normally, and by the way, parts of these processes continued in the regular run of things throughout the 2 years this inquiry is covering. You'd have back and forth making your requests at budget or spending review. You'd produce the analysis, you'd have to basically try and justify, and that's when you would end up having a meeting with the Chancellor or the Chief Secretary of the Treasury to basically have a bit of a kind of face-to-face on why this really mattered, minister to minister. So this is, I'm not trying to say the Treasury aren't agile, they are, but I think it was more dynamic, and that was helpful in coming to shared understandings on situations.
And you also said...
By the way, I also... Sorry.
Not at all.
Talk over you.
No, not at all. You finish.
One of the things I tried to do in my time as Secretary of State was to give my officials more confidence that they were actually the experts on a lot of stuff that he was doing, and to be more confident in that, in their dealings with the Treasury. The Treasury is a classic in terms of they have to approve the spending. That's fine. So they should. But we should also they may not have the variety of experience that DWP has had in its interactions with its customers and wider elements. So just being a bit more pushback on some of perhaps assumptions that Treasury officials had jumped to, and showing why that may or may not be the case. I'm talking quite generically, but it is that element of not just taking what the Treasury says as gospel.
Do you think then that the need for speedier working in government that the pandemic brought about brought closer together those who were funding government activity, the Treasury, and those who were responsible for delivering it, as in the department? So it bridged that gap between delivery and funding?
Well, I think it was an experience that almost required that to happen. I'm a great believer in sharing as much as possible rather than trying to hold or hide, because if one side of the argument doesn't understand why this matters to you and the backup for why you're doing it, then you can understand when they get a bit defensive. So I just tried to change that element of culture in our thinking of how we interacted with the Treasury. It's not a criticism of DWP beforehand, far from it. But I think it's just aspects of my level of experience in business of how you try to come to the best outcome. But I'll give credit to both my department and Treasury on trying to work this through.
And more generous than normal is also how you describe the Treasury.
Yeah.
Now, I don't imagine you mean by that they were just giving out lots and lots of money that they wouldn't normally hand over. What were you meaning by they were more generous than normal?
Well, I think they were prepared to look at things again, which had been ruled out, to my understanding, like changing the local housing allowance rate. That very quickly became a straightforward way to get more money to people straight away, about £1 billion, helping many households across the country. Now, I think if it hadn't been for COVID, I don't think we would have got that change. But this was a straightforward way to try and put some more money into people's pockets.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And you go on in your statement to describe that you discussed with the Chancellor and then established a cell, as you essentially, between the Treasury and your department, which put together a small group of officials. It was paragraph 9 of your statement, a small group of policy officials from your two departments that could collaborate and work closely together. So, first of all, should we understand that was something that didn't exist before?
Correct.
Yeah. And what was the advantage of working in that way, so far as you were concerned?
We had a smaller group of people who were able to interact within minutes, or exchanging work very quickly. And that was useful. It was also an element of confidentiality. As I say, you've already seen to some extent some of the email chains that result, which can end up being pages long. And this way, I think the relevant issues could be kind of a small group of people, instead of advice taking quite a long time to come up to ministers, by having our Director General, Jonathan Mills, involved, able to do that very quick communication. It's like, this is what we're thinking about, where are you on this, and back and forth. So I think it's fair to say I found that very useful, and I think the Chancellor, my understanding is he found it very useful as well.
Okay. We, or the inquiries received evidence about the policy partnership that exists and has existed for a long time between the Treasury and Revenue and Customs. There wasn't a formal policy partnership between the Treasury and the Department of Work and Pensions. Were you aware of any efforts to try and establish a similar arrangement, or is the cell that you've spoken about as close as it came, essentially?
Well, I think, taking a step back about the machinery of government, in 2005, HMRC was formed by legislation, and it brought together Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise. But the key difference of that to other departments is HMRC was a non-ministerial department, and that's done deliberately so that Treasury could not get involved in effectively individual tax cases. But so that partnership was already there, because in other normal circumstances, apart from that concern about personal confidentiality and not allowing ministers to interfere, if it weren't for that specific reason, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be part of Treasury anyway. So they're just interlocked, candidly. And actually, in the Coronavirus Act, Treasury took a power to be able to issue ministerial directions to HMRC, very specifically so they could just get on and make decisions quickly instead of it going through their process. So I think it's a particular situation, and there's a formality. Throughout lots of COVID, one of our challenges at times was having to agree memorandums of understanding with other arm's length bodies in different departments, which was a bit of a pain, candidly. But this allowed them, this ongoing relationship they had, it wasn't a surprise to me. It was just business as usual for them. I think more broadly, we already had in effect an element of policy partnership because of our considerations and our ongoing fact that our department was responsible for distributing billions of pounds to over 22 million households.
So would your view be then that the policy partnership is unique as between the Treasury and HMRC because the relationship between those two organisations is unique within government, with HMRC being a non-ministerial department and given its function?
I think that formality of what's called a policy partnership is due to that governance structure.
Yeah. Can I just pick up on one discrete issue arising from joint working with the devolved administrations?
Sure.
And that is in particular with the Welsh government. There's evidence received by the inquiry that the Welsh government was seeking access to Department of Work and Pensions data on universal credit, and it took some time for that to be resolved, but it was then resolved. Were you aware of that as an issue?
Well, I'm conscious, I'm trying to remember if it was specifically Wales. Because of the way our benefit systems work, we had a much closer relationship, principally in terms of the benefit side, with the Scottish government, because the Scotland Act started to devolve benefits, and we operated this on their behalf, and we already had a particular relationship with Northern Ireland. So our interaction with Wales when it came to benefits was different because the Welsh government had no powers over it at all. Now, more broadly, and I know the department was actually very protective of its data because we were dealing with some of the most vulnerable people in our country. So we're quite careful about how that information was released to others. So it wouldn't surprise me if that had taken a bit of time to sort out and what level of data people were looking for in that regard. We didn't want to risk any kind of data breaches. So there's an element that my department will have gone through on trying to verify how they would be using and holding the data.
Is there any learning that could be drawn from that in terms of data sharing in a future emergency?
I think there probably is, and it's not unique to that situation of sharing. I think setting out expectations early on would probably help on how some of that could be, on what format it could be given out and at what level. Given that we do generate quite a lot of statistics already. So what I don't know, Lady Hallett, is what level of data the Welsh Government were actually asking for. So without knowing that specific, undoubtedly data sharing in government has got more straightforward, but we did have issues, for example, dealing with the NHS as another example. So.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Lady Coffey. That completes my questions on that first topic. So I'm going to move to the second broad topic, which is Kickstart. Before I get into questions about Kickstart specifically, can I just pick up at this stage a few questions about the principles of good policy making generally for government? And I'm sure these, or I hope these won't be controversial. Do you agree, first of all, there's a need to have clear goals, so clear objectives of policy that are identified?
Yes.
That those should be evidence-based, so evidence should be informing policy?
Well, sometimes you need to be novel. So I think being prepared to understand your objectives and where you're heading and how you might evaluate that along the way and be agile is important. Sometimes you don't have the evidence in policy formation. You've got to set out a supposition and then adjust accordingly if it's not meeting what you're expecting.
Okay. Subject to the need for confidentiality of the type you've referred to with personal data, have you found that open consultation with key stakeholders is an important part of policy formulation and implementation?
So I think regular conversations with stakeholders, or we also use data in DWP of things like the Family Resource Survey, will give us a sense of picture. It's actually one of the things that during our wider work, which we may get onto later, I wanted to increase the survey size so we could get starting to get more granular level of understanding of what was happening in different parts of the country. So you just have to bear in mind what is your survey based on. But being a member of Parliament at the time, you do have a difference, and all the other MPs talking to you do have a sense of what is happening and where you might want to think. I'm not sure, sorry, I'm probably taking us down a segue, but you get to engage with stakeholders in a number of ways when you're a minister and member of Parliament. And so I think having multiple sources, but you can't judge by anecdote.
No.
And that's the key thing, that we need to work out what senses might be going on through anecdote, but then try and take that away and understand, is that really an issue in this regard?
It's important, isn't it, to have a focus in policy making in terms of implementation, so how you're actually going to deliver the policy. Would you agree with that?
I certainly do.
Yeah. And in terms of policy going forwards, that there needs to be an iterative process. In other words, it's important to monitor how a policy is landing, to have a process of evaluation, and to make adjustment over time, if necessary.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So can we turn on to Kickstart itself? Now, Kickstart as a scheme, as the inquiry understands, it was part of the Treasury's plan for jobs that was announced on the 8th of July of 2020, and it was described by the Treasury in correspondence with your department as a flagship policy. Can you just explain to us, please, what the plan for jobs was and where Kickstart fitted into that plan?
Well, Plan for Jobs was actually an umbrella term for a series of departments coming together to try and get people to stay in work, to get into work, thinking of skills. So Department for Education was involved in different ways. We clearly were, and working with the Treasury as well. So Kickstart in particular, one of the big concerns that the Chancellor, that Rishi and I shared, was about the effect potentially of this pandemic on young people, and to try and avoid economic scarring. So that was a key element of thinking about people newly or recently into the jobs market. So Kickstart was a different sort of scheme, which there'd been a similar scheme through the Future Jobs Fund after the financial crisis, but we saw this as an opportunity to put a significant investment into young people, as well as the other job schemes which came as well, Job Finding Service, JETS, Restart, and so on, swaps, all these different things in order to try and have a more tailored approach, thinking of the cohorts of people that we were trying to help.
And you mentioned there that the Chancellor and you had this concern about young people and the dangers of scarring on them economically. And so it's right, isn't it, that the department, your department and and HMRC worked closely together on the design of Kickstart.
Yes.
And in government spending terms, it was an expensive intervention on a per head basis.
Yeah. So I think the budget ended up being roughly £2 billion.
Yeah. And I think it was estimated to be about £7,000 per head. So per person who was assisted by the scheme was being spent. Now, in terms of job support, that sounds like quite a lot of money to invest. Is that how you viewed it?
I saw it as a way to help. So the economic scarring, there's good evidence that shows that if young people in particular don't get into work, it gets harder and harder for them to get a job. So trying to facilitate that was, I think, there was a business case put together, there was all sorts of valuations done. This is why during the process we looked at different aspects of unit costs that we were prepared to give to help facilitate this. But overall, we used the basis of a Future Jobs Fund on thinking about so many hours per week that we would pay for. So my impression is, or the expectations were, it was going to be good value for money, and I believe that's what the evaluation later showed.
Yeah. And it was a plan that had 4 core objectives that you've set out in your statement at paragraph 214, but I'll just give them to you to assist. As you've said, it was focused on the 16 to 24 year age group, so young people, and it was designed to improve their employability and chances of sustained employment for those who had been at risk of long-term unemployment. So that was the first objective, is that right?
Yes, and it was different to the Future Jobs Fund because we wanted wraparound support. So people would spend some time getting that extra bit of help, in effect thinking about being job ready for what the next job could be.
Yeah. And secondly, was it also focused on the creation of jobs? So this wasn't just about matching young people to jobs that already existed, but it was about trying to support the creation of new jobs in the economy.
Well, one of the very clear criteria by the Treasury was about additionality. What we wanted to avoid was that people would be laid off and then employers taking people on basically for free to them, because that wouldn't have been very sensible. But I think it gave itself the opportunity to open up a whole areas of employment for young people that traditionally they might not have got into. So with candidly quite low risk on behalf of the employer.
The third objective was to make sure, as you put it, that there was a quality experience for participants, so that the placement was one that delivered that quality experience. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's what we were hoping to do.
And then also, finally, it was a policy designed to incentivise positive behaviour amongst placement holders, so making them attractive to future employers. Was that the other objective?
Yes, he was somebody, hopefully, in getting a future job, will have done several months of work, turned up on time, done the work effectively, had learned as they went along. So these were all substantial benefits.
And thereby became more attractive when they applied for another job because they had that experience. They got into the habit of work, of being there on time, of turning up and doing a good job. Yeah. So putting all that together, that was all designed at trying to reduce scarring by unemployment on that sector of young people, is that?
Yes.
I think the Chancellor of the Exchequer had a very keen interest in job creation schemes. Is that fair to say?
I think he wanted to try and his broader approach, and this was true of the furlough scheme, was we didn't know how long this was going to last. The then Prime Minister was hopeful that we could get through it by the summer, but we had to anticipate it could go longer than that. And I know Rishi in particular was very keen in thinking of aspects of the furlough scheme, or how it was explained to me, I should say. I shouldn't speak for him, of trying to keep connections between employers and their employees, but also to try and do whatever we could, because there were still jobs available. And although certain jobs closed down, how we were able to redirect people or get them to go into sorts of different potential careers, which was there. And Kickstart was there for people who didn't really have very much experience of work at all. So it was, in terms of job creation, I don't know if particularly it was about we did think about how we helped certain sectors more on other programmes, like JETS, where we were strategic on what we were trying to do with aspects of that. But on this one, it was just trying to get some people into work.
I'm just going to ask for a document to be put on the screen, please, INQ 00592948, which is part of the Kickstart Policy Experience Guide. And just pick up on that middle paragraph initially, where it says that initially the DWP Secretary of State was hesitant about the benefits of job creation schemes. Treasury colleagues indicated the Chancellor was keen to explore further and sets out the objective. First of all, do you recognise that as being your position initially, that you were hesitant about the benefits?
I don't, and I think Katie Farrington puts it in her evidence later, or covers it in her evidence. What I didn't want to do was to have just an identical replication of the Future Job Fund scheme, where we gave money to some councils, some charities, some other organisations, and like, there you go. We were looking at this as a basis, and it's just like, I really want the private sector involved. I want proper jobs, not just stuff to keep people busy for a day. This has got to be meaningful in that regard. So I don't agree with that assessment of what I was thinking at that time.
Would this better reflect what you were thinking, which was, I would be hesitant about another scheme that did what was already being done? If this was something different and actually produced quality, then I would be supportive of it. Is that effectively, or was that your position?
I think I can't specifically recall that exactly. I do recall general discussions about, here's the playbook from last time. Let's start off with this. It's just like, well, I don't want to do exactly what we did last time. I want to create real jobs.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We can take that down. You say in your statement that you felt that elements of the policy design were over-engineered and that there needed to be greater flexibility. And I'd just like to explore with you what you meant by that. In what sense was the scheme or the policy over-engineered, and what greater flexibility were you looking for?
Well, one of the things that I did pretty quickly, in contrast to the Future Jobs Fund, was remove the community element, which had been part of FJF, which had basically excluded most private sector. When we got into later into understanding some of the flow of what was happening with Kickstart, aspects of things like whether a job was additional or not started to get quite complicated, overly complicated, and that's where I felt at times we were over-engineering instead of trying to do something more straightforward, more simple, that actually businesses applying to give jobs could properly understand. So I think that's an element of where over-engineering will have happened, from my recollection, will have happened.
And as the scheme developed, do you think you were able to overcome that over-engineering that you were concerned about?
Definitely. I also got one of my other ministers involved, a lady called Baroness Debbie Stedman Scott. She'd had many years of experience running a jobs-focused charity called Tomorrow's People and getting people into work. And so using a combination of our strengths, we were able to do some deep dives, workshops, really trying to get into, look, we've got lots of jobs being offered. We're turning down a lot of these jobs, especially coming from the private sector. Why are we doing that? And so we started just having to be agile because we weren't achieving some of our original objectives, and it was needed assessing.
So as far as you were concerned, did you find that as the scheme developed, it continued to be, or continued to evolve, so it did become more flexible?
Well, I think we managed to fine-tune it. We put this together at pretty short notice. Officials had told us this would take well over a year. I mean, frankly, there wouldn't have been much point to it waiting over a year for our purposes of trying to get young people into jobs. So I'm not going to shy away from the fact it may not have been perfect when it started. But it started off, we were getting people, employers signed up. We did get people working in November. So we got it going. And like a lot of things during that time, you just need to check, is it working to its full intention? If it's not, what is it that's going wrong? And I felt I was able to use the strengths of my own business experience, my lead and led non-executive director, special advisor, other ministers, to really try and just constantly looking for constant improvement to it.
You obviously didn't want the scheme to take a year to stand up, but looking at on the other side, did you feel that the Treasury was pushing too fast for the scheme to be introduced, so that there was a risk the other way, that it wouldn't be well designed?
No, I agreed that we needed to try and get this moving. It kind of knew it would be quite tight, and but I used to say this a lot in DWP, let's not be the enemy of good. It's true in quite a lot of government. Something can be wonderful, but actually if nobody takes it up or does it, then it ends up becoming somewhat nugatory. So I think there's a lot of, and especially given the dynamic situation that we were experiencing during COVID, I think it was important to try and get something going, get the young people working, and the feedback from them through a variety of surveys was generally very positive about their experience.
I'm just going to ask for a couple of sections from the statement of Mims Davis to be brought up,
Okay.
Which is INQ 00661480. And paragraph 58 in particular at the bottom there. Her reflection was that there were differences in perspective between the Treasury and DWP at times, particularly around pace and delivery expectations, and they were addressed constructively. Can you help us as to, first of all, whether you agree that there were differences in perspective between the Treasury and the DWP?
Well, it wouldn't surprise me if at official level, and Mims, as Minister for Employment, will have been involved at this, that it's like, can we really get this launched by September? Whereas it wouldn't surprise me if somebody from Treasury had said, why can't we launch this next week? I mean, I'm perhaps being somewhat in my hyperbole. You do this, and it does take time. But when I was initially told, ideally, Future Jobs Fund took over a year to do it, it's like, we haven't got time for that. So we had to move at pace. And I supported, in my discussions with the Chancellor, what I thought was reasonable to get to a starting point.
Yeah. And if If I could have up, please, INQ 000655 This is a letter to Katie Farrington, is that right? We can see there, and it says, that top paragraph, as you know, Kickstart is the flagship policy in the government's plan for jobs. It is a priority of the Chancellors to ensure that the scheme is delivered effectively and urgently. It's critical we maintain this momentum ahead of the scheme's launch. So that appears to be push coming from the Chancellor directly, that this has got to land urgently. Did you share that view, that there was an urgency about standing the scheme up?
Yes.
And I think, if I could have up, please, back to Mims Davis' statement, INQ 00661480, and paragraph 141 when we've got it up. So this is at page 41, I think. Mims Davis there. This Kickstart scheme was delivered at pace, launched as a minimum viable product to ensure that support was available for young people in uncertain, unprecedented times. And then in the middle of that paragraph, the Secretary of State, which is a reference to you, I believe, Lady Coffey, had made clear that it was non-negotiable that there should be young people starting Kickstart jobs, and they should be given priority at the beginning of November 2020. And then goes on, the approach to delivery was designed to manage this risk. Kickstart was to be launched as a minimum viable product with all elements in place for jobs to start by November 2020. That appears to be you sharing the urgency of the Chancellor that this needs to be stood up.
That's right.
And we've got to get people into these jobs by November 2020 at the latest.
That's right. I think we had a launch event at Canary Wharf very early September. So it had been announced by the Chancellor as part of his statement, and we had a lot of interest, and we wanted to show that we were open for business.
To put November 2020 into a bit of context in the pandemic, November 2020 had been the time at which the coronavirus job retention scheme, as initially implemented, was due to end. Was there a fear, therefore, shared by you and the Chancellor, that there would be a rise in unemployment potentially if the scheme had ended in November 2020, and that's why there was a need to have this scheme stood up and ready to go to combat that?
So I don't recall exactly, but we were concerned about potential youth unemployment, yes. A lot of this was on this wider element of trying to how we get economic growth coming back into the economy as quickly as possible. You know, with the hope, desire of trying to recover almost immediately from COVID. So if the furlough scheme had ended then, if everybody was going back to work like normal, then there wouldn't be necessarily those brand new jobs. So having further opportunities, in particular for young people, to get roles was important. In my mind right now, I can't definitively say that it was linked time-wise to the end of furlough, but it may be that it is, and it's in a document somewhere where it is.
I think, in fairness to you, it's paragraph 299 of your statement. You said, no, don't worry. I mean, it's a very significant statement, and this isn't a memory test, so that's why I'm trying to help.
Right.
But you do reference there the fact that furlough was initially going to end in November of 2020, and there was this concern, therefore, that there would be a rise in unemployment at around that time.
Apologies. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And you go on elsewhere in your statement to observe that your officials had initially been telling you this will take between 11 and 15 months to design and stand up as a scheme. But in fact, the department had it stood up by November of 2020. How was that possible? Were there trade-offs in terms of scheme design, or does that reflect the sort of agility of and the speed at which decisions could be made when things were urgent and needed to be done?
Agility and drive, I would say. Can you imagine, as a work coach, what an exciting moment it would be for that person to help them get into a great job? Our work coaches are really driven people. It's very exciting to get money from the Treasury to pay for new jobs, that you can help that young person hopefully get a great experience. And importantly, 6 months of guaranteed work. And that job security is actually a really important element of why Kickstart mattered, in particular for young people. I remember going on a visit to one of the M&S schemes, and this young lady, a graduate, I said, "Oh, why have you come on Kickstart?" And she said, "Well, I'm very keen to get into retail." She said, "All these other shops are laying people off, so M&S will naturally take on people who've already got experience in retail. Here, there was this great scheme where I got to work for a leading company in retail, got their HR, got all these other things." And she said, "I really hope this now can kickstart properly," she used the phrase, "kickstart my career with this." And the 6 months was also a key thing. She said, because classically, when you're trying to get jobs, people might be taken on for just 3 months, or if that. So that was an important element of trying to help young people, and a genuinely exciting time for the department.
We saw in Mims Davis' statement that was put up on the screen it being described as a minimum viable product at the time it was implemented. And I just wonder if you could, first of all, tell us what you understand by that and whether you agree with that as a description.
Well, I think it's fair to say, I think it's a terminology created by the department. There's different levels of what kind of systems you would have gone through in terms of checking X, Y, Z. On Restart, which we'll come on to later, that did take over a year, go through a lot more iterations, and trying to avoid having to make adjustments. So from my perspective, I felt it was a good product on which to start, absolutely. And if we needed to make changes, then we could.
Okay. So get it started and refine it as it goes if we need to.
If we need to.
Yeah. So we've got at least the minimum that we can get started, and if we need to, we can tweak it along the way, rather than spending 11 to 15 months delivering a perfect product.
Yeah.
That wouldn't need any adjustment that could be foreseen. Was that really the trade-off?
An element of that, but it is about grasping the moment.
I'm just going to ask that INQ 000657741 is put up, please. This is paragraph 150 of the statement of Katie Farrington, page 46. Or it isn't. That's not what I was expecting on the screen, so let's not worry about what's on the screen. And okay. Something had to go wrong. Let me just ask the question. Katie Farrington says in her statement, now she was the senior responsible officer, I think it is, the SRO for Kickstart. And she makes this point about the link between, there we are. It's paragraph 132. She says this: during this time, we were expecting the lockdown and the furlough scheme both to end in November 2020. We did not know that the furlough scheme would be extended and that there would be successive waves of lockdown affecting the labour market. Had we known in advance that the furlough scheme was going to be extended in November 2020 and that there'd be further lockdowns in October 20 and January 21, which would disrupt the labour market, we might have recommended to ministers to take longer in designing the scheme and to introduce it later. So this is linking the timing of the implementation of the scheme with lockdown and saying essentially that officials might have said, well, let's take the time now. Where would that have sat with you at the time as advice? Would you have taken the view that, no, let's get this stood up now and refine it as it goes? So let's run with the minimum viable product?
Absolutely.
And why would you have held that view?
Well, going back to the element of over-engineering, you've got a novel situation, you've got an offer of significant amount of support from the Treasury at the personal level of the Chancellor, who, while that money was allocated, he very specifically had said there'd be no cap. If this was a huge success, he would put more money into it if it was needed. And I didn't feel that we needed to go round. We had a fairly basic product. We would pay employers 25 hours. We would do, and taking some of this from Future Jobs Fund. I'm not entirely sure how much more, although we might have been in a better place on trying to perhaps get some of the management reporting going. We might have had more ministerial involvement, perhaps. Actually, I shouldn't over-speculate. I would have wanted to go for it. Because by that time, a lot of young people will have been unemployed already for a few months. So we needed to still get going.
Can I just interrupt there? I don't actually understand. I appreciate you didn't write the statement. It's not your words. I don't understand the link being made here between the furlough scheme being extended, which was all about people who were already in jobs and therefore had to be put on furlough, with the Kickstart scheme. I can still understand the more lockdowns. That seems to make sense. I'm just not understanding why she's making the link.
I think it's probably an element of would there be job opportunities? Because people would have, if the furlough scheme comes to an end, I think that, I'm at risk of speculating now, right. That COVID was over and people would just go back to work and the economy...
So the opportunity, I follow, yeah.
So that's possibly where it's coming from. I think, forgive me, it's quite a few years ago. I'm trying to remember the intricacies of some of our
I shouldn't encourage speculation. Thank you.
Was there not also a concern, though, that when the furlough scheme ended, not everybody who'd been furloughed would go back into their job, that some employers would then make people redundant because they were no longer being supported by the government in paying their wages. So there would be an increase generally in unemployment at the end of the furlough scheme. And that would put pressure on young people.
That could be a consideration. I'd say my understanding of the furlough was to try and lock in where employers to employees in a ready way. I mean, not every employer took advantage of the furlough scheme. So it would vary significantly, I think.
You say in your statement that the indicative target for Kickstart was to achieve 250,000 placements. 250,000 placements is what you were hoping to achieve. But ultimately, 168,000 young people started a Kickstart job. Now, that's obviously 168,000 young people who had that opportunity, but it's some way from the 250,000 that was anticipated. Why do you think the uptake was lower by that magnitude from that which had been expected?
So I think a few things did happen during that time. We did have the lockdown. So there was a bit of a stop-start situation, which perhaps if I take a step back, when we opened up the Kickstart, the officials had said to me there's no way they could cope with individual applications. They wouldn't be able to process that. and I'd said quite clearly, I want us to get to a point where people can just say, I want to take on one Kickstarter. So we found a way using what we call gateways. But we also found a number of employers took on saying, right, I want 30 places, but we accepted it might be come in waves of them taking people on. So I didn't want us to particularly go over the allotment of jobs available, or jobs we'd allocated money to, in effect. But then we started to see in our information data, so-and-so has said that they will take on 90 people, and they've taken on 5. So there's a balance of what we had to get back into, and we started to develop something later about use it or lose it. So I think aspects of having put that initial barrier in, or hurdle, I should say, we came to realise that we should have been placing more people, but actually the employers, despite saying they take on however many people it was, or a gateway taking on 1,000 people, or an employment agency through Gateway Plus, they weren't actually taking the numbers. So then we had to work through why wasn't it that they weren't taking on the young people, grant agreements weren't coming back, or... So it took quite a lot of... the take-up quite early on in the scheme was quite small. So then we had a series of deep dives, workshops, looking at the monitoring, the weekly monitoring, to try and make sure we increase the take-up of roles. Yeah. So I think it's a combination of factors.
One of the other factors that you mentioned in your statement at paragraph 271 is that in some areas of the country, there were more vacancies than there were eligible young people to take up those vacancies. So was there a geographical difference depending on where you were in the country in some instances?
So there was definitely some mismatches. So I used to represent Suffolk. It turns out that when I started looking at this in more and more detail, we had offered Kickstart funding in effect to, say, Norfolk and Suffolk. And then I was getting complaints from farmers and other local employers just like, we've got this Kickstart job waiting. What is going on? Why aren't they being filled? And then I went looking into the data more at a granular level, and then it turns out we'd offered too many Kickstart placements. Now, I can't recall exactly if there was rationale there that giving a bit of choice to young people, but I then just like, hold on, let's get this sorted. We shouldn't be having, while in other parts of the country we've got more young people needing a role, but we didn't want to get into set allocations of quotas, like the North East has to have this many or other things like that. It was very much employers, here's an opportunity to give young people a help, and we'll help you to take them on. So that needed refining as well.
I'm just going to ask if INQ 000657661 could be brought up on the screen, please. And then, there we are. This is a briefing from the Treasury titled Kickstart Policy Design. It's dated 10th of August of 2020. And it says there to try and create more jobs than FJF. What's that? Future Jobs Fund, is that FJF? Yeah, okay. The Department of Work and Pensions is streamlining the employer application process and removing barriers to private sector involvement. I think that's something you picked up on earlier. You were keen to have the private sector involved in this. However, given the unpredictable nature of the local and national economic situation, where entire areas may be locked down, DWP is creating a strategy to ensure Kickstart can adapt and achieve national coverage. Was there a formal strategy to do that?
Well, Lady Hallett, Mr. Wright, I don't know the date of when this briefing...
10th of August 2020.
Okay. So we wanted to make sure there were jobs available around the country, for sure. Yeah.
But, I mean, was there a formal strategy to do that? I mean, that's an aspiration. Let's have jobs available around the country. But was that taken forward in any particular way?
Well, initially, what was happening was, as I say, employers came forward, and we did at some point introduce the concept. I think that got called account managers. This was learnings brought in from some of us ministers of how you try and manage relationships. What I don't know is the extent of how we approached lots of employers. I know early on Tesco was keen to be involved, and to the extent that they also said they didn't want to be paid by taxpayers' money to do this, but wanted to get involved in the Kickstart approach. And that in itself led to, we knew that there would be jobs around the country. So I don't think we went into the level of detail that you might be looking for in that regard.
Was there a sense in which Kickstart was struggling to get the numbers because it was being launched at a time where there were still significant public health restrictions, so the further lockdowns and also regional variations in lockdown that might have been feeding into this problem of getting young people into jobs in certain areas?
Well, for what it's worth, we got more young people into Kickstart jobs than ever happened under the Future Jobs Fund. So I think it was actually a success. Could we have done it even better? In hindsight, yes. And a lot of the learnings, I think I put it in my reflections, I actually think the current Chancellor has a pretty much ready-made product if you wanted to use it. And the Secretary of State at DWP now, if they wanted to deploy, with a lot of the learnings that we got along the way. And some of that was, as we gathered more and did more deep dives, trying to unlock management information was a key way of trying to help us understand.
You've told us that the target group was 16 to 24-year-olds, so young people. Is it right that, in fact, young people who were in receipt of job seekers allowance, so the legacy benefit, were not eligible for Kickstart?
Yes, it was designed to particularly get people somewhat new to avoid that economic scarring. There's also an element of how some of this gets built into the universal credit system, often referred to, including in what will be exhibits, the UC Build. And the relationship with the work coach and the person making the claimant commitment on this would then somewhat generate opportunities for jobs as part of that interaction between the work coach and the client. It's a different relationship, really, to how other work coaches focused on those people on the legacy benefits had their interactions with their customers, because they had already been out of employment for quite some time.
Now, those might have been all very good reasons not to include those people at the outset, say, but you said this was developing as it went along. Mm-hmm. Numbers were lower than expected. In some areas, there weren't enough eligible people, so enough young people in receipt of universal credit for the jobs that were available. Why not, as it developed, expand it to allow young people in receipt of job seekers allowance the opportunity that Kickstart presented?
Well, there were some proposals even to put it above the age of 25 plus, and that was taking it away from its key focus of thinking about young people, the broader offer. I think it's a different, as I say, situation. People who were, say, still on income support will have been unemployed for a long time. And so quite often, trying to help people to get job ready would require certain steps along the way before getting straight into Kickstart. So there was an element of simplicity to try and keep this. We're talking in East Anglia, where perhaps some of the jobs, we're talking about a handful of jobs perhaps not being filled because there were a difference in people deemed eligible versus jobs available. That was just one example.
I suppose what I'm really asking is, what was the downside in saying, look, every young person, regardless of which benefit they happen to be claiming, let's give everybody the opportunity?
Well, there were plenty of young people. This came up, I can't recall at what moment there was a realisation that some jobs in, I think it was East Anglia and Cumbria, where we had a mismatch in numbers, but in the rest of the country that certainly wasn't happening. So to then unravel kind of what the existing system that used UC, that work coach client commitment and claimant commitment approach, I'd say it was a different relationship for those people who'd been on benefits for a long time.
Because another group of young people who might be unemployed who were ineligible were those in receipt of certain disability benefits, for example, PIP claimants. And I'm going to ask you why they weren't able to access Kickstart, again, if there was a lower uptake.
Anyone on PIP could absolutely, if they were on universal credit as well. PIP
if they were on universal credit. But
yeah.
What about those who were claiming PIP but not on universal credit? They'd be excluded, wouldn't they?
Well, this was about trying to get people who were on benefits to get them into a job. If you weren't claiming universal credit, you wouldn't it wouldn't be flagged to us that you were looking for a job.
Well, can I ask that INQ 000626 is put up, please? This is from Justin Tomlinson, who was the Minister for Disabled People. I understand we want people to move from legacy to universal credit to qualify. That said, surely there aren't many under 25s on legacy rather than universal credit. As for quite some time, new claimants can only enter benefits via universal credit. I would personally like to see Kickstart open to PIP claimants under 25. This would be a big boost for disability employment. I mean, were you aware that the Minister for Disabled People was pushing for that expansion?
Yeah, I think if read further on some of this stuff, I think Justin is thinking about the people who weren't claiming benefits, apart from PIP. And we didn't have a relationship in terms of job searching for people who weren't claiming UC. That's how I've interpreted all at the time. And opening extra, I think it'll be an exhibit somewhere. I think I do recognise the incentive or the attractiveness of people coming onto UC if they were on the legacy benefits in order to access this as a way to make some of that. One of the reasons why a lot of people on legacy benefits that were going to be replaced by UC were waiting to be moved is they were worried in case their benefits would fall. Well, if they had started a job, they'd have to move on to universal credit anyway. So some of that nervousness would have automatically gone away because you would automatically be getting a salary that would take you off your legacy benefits, that would take you onto the UC system.
I think I might be able
I'm
to...
sorry if it sounds quite complicated, and it is.
I might be able to help with that exhibit, so let's see if I can. INQ 00592945. This is a submission to you as Secretary of State from 19th of February 2021 on access to Kickstart for young people on legacy benefits. And we see there at the bottom, let's start with the summary. You've asked for advice on expanding eligibility to claimants on employment and support allowance. This submission also provides advice on access to the Kickstart scheme for claimants in receipt of job seekers allowance and personal independence payment. And if we go to the advice recommendation part of that recommendation, we continue to focus Kickstart on the current target group of young people aged 16 to 24 on universal credit. especially as the link between Kickstart and Universal Credit is perceived as a potential incentive to encourage legacy claimants to transfer to Universal Credit. The option to expand to further groups of claimants with disabilities and health conditions is considered for a potential further phase of Kickstart to run beyond the life of the current scheme. I don't know if that was exactly the exhibit you were thinking of, but that seems to articulate, I think, what you just said in your answer.
I think the exhibit I'm thinking of, and I'm sorry, I've got so many I can't quite remember, it's my handwritten notes in response to this, which then generates a response from the private secretary.
I'm just, again, wondering why, given that there was a lower uptake by almost 90,000 people than you'd planned for, it wouldn't have been a good idea to just expand this scheme to those people who are being talked about in that submission, or was this in part because you wanted people to be encouraged to move across to Universal Credit?
What I'd hoped to try to explain earlier is that there were plenty of young people on Universal Credit looking for a job. I think that we had some issues in terms of following up the whole pipeline of how we got people from an employer being accepted to then jobs actually happening. So this would have been an added, which would have perhaps impacted a very small number of people, is my recollection in the numbers of people given to me. We needed to keep our focus on basically jobs have been offered, or as it turns out, some of those hadn't been cemented in terms of actual opportunities for young people. That's what we need to fix, because we have plenty of people waiting to try and get a Kickstart job.
Can I move on to monitoring and evaluation? Just a few questions, and then we'll have finished the Kickstart section of my questions in time for the break. There was an evaluation of Kickstart. It did find that it had had a beneficial impact for participants and found that there had been returns for the taxpayer. The inquiry has received evidence to that effect. But can I ask you this, really, having picked up the position of disabled people, young disabled people, one of the things that the evaluation found was that those with long-term health conditions did not gain as much advantage from Kickstart as others. So their placements were not as successful, their long-term prospects not as improved. Do you think, looking ahead, that in the future there should be consideration to a separate or more focused scheme that is focused on those with those sort of long-term conditions to help them get back into work?
Well, that's accommodated already, I would say, and I wouldn't want Lady Hallett to think in some way that people with disabilities were excluded from Kickstart. That is simply not the case. Absolutely not the case. In fact, on evidence that I've submitted, I specifically refer to make sure that we're really getting the access to work scheme well understood and well advertised, that we've got the flexible support fund. This is given to individual job centres to help people with access to work in a variety of ways. So it wasn't about, far from ignoring people with disabilities, it was just making sure that we had extra levers, making sure all of our work coaches across the country were deploying them to do that. So in terms of the future, a separate example, Severn Trent in particular, to use the Kickstart opportunity to take on people perhaps of the neurodiverse spectrum as a way of trying to get them and build their confidence about being in work as well. So there was a number of situations where my impression would be people who might otherwise have struggled to get a job, got a job thanks to Kickstart. But thinking ahead, disability is quite wide-ranging, so I think the Access to Work scheme is still a really important part of that. And one of the things that could be strengthened, perhaps we could have increased the budget for Access to Work, but I don't know if that was the main barrier about the amount of money available. in that regard. I don't think it particularly was, and I don't think it was brought to my attention ever that there was a lack of money in order for these different funds.
So essentially, I think you're making the point that there is a suite of schemes, suite of measures available across the piece. Kickstart is one of them, and it's necessary to look at the entire offering.
That's right, and the work and health programme more broadly, all the other elements of Plan for Jobs, but existing tools that we already used to help people with disabilities in order to get a job. Bear in mind, we'd been set a challenge in the 2017 manifesto of getting 1 million people people with disability into work within a decade, and we did it in 5 years. The idea of aspects of disability was just in our DNA. We were preparing a national disability strategy. So it's not like just people with disabilities were parked somewhere, far from it. It was part of the stuff that we did every day within DWP. And that doesn't mean to say it's not challenging. Of course, there's still a disability employment gap. But progress has been made on that and was made on that under my time as Secretary of State at DWP.
Thank you very much. That takes us to the
Right,
break.
we'll take a slightly longer break today. I shall return at 25 to 12. Straight.
Thank you, my lady. Lady Coffey, the bad news is that I hadn't dealt with the 3 topics I wanted to, but the good news is I don't need to deal with Restart because we've picked it up as we've gone in terms of the questions I wanted to ask about part of the future Plan for Jobs. So I'm going to move on to statutory sick pay, and in particular the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. And just to set the scene, the statutory sick pay rebate scheme, the inquiry understands, went live on the 26th of May 2020, and it was targeted on SMEs, small, medium enterprises with less than 250 members of staff, and it allowed 2 weeks per employee, so 14 days. And the inquiry understands that your department were the policy owners, that the direction, much of it was coming from the Treasury, but HMRC were responsible for delivery. So 3 departments effectively working together. Does that all accord with your understanding?
Health and Bays a bit as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So this is cross-government working to bring that scheme in. And the objective of the rebate scheme was essentially to protect those businesses from the increased costs of paying statutory sick pay to workers during the pandemic. That was the objective.
Yes. The underlying objective was to try and make sure that what we could do was to help the Department of Health get people to be able to reasonably comply with the guidelines. And we didn't want to be in the situation where people felt they had to go to work or an issue with employers and employees. So this was a credible way of and straightforward way of trying to help employers with the costs of the compliance, which at the time was initially 7 days if you got symptoms, but if in your household somebody had symptoms, you were supposed to stay away for 14 days. So this is where all this sort of thinking came, but it was a way of helping with the costs.
And so this was an economic scheme aligned with the public health restrictions.
Absolutely.
And as you've just said, that the rationale for 2 weeks was that at the time, the maximum period of self-isolation for somebody with coronavirus was 14 days.
That's right.
And so that's why the 2 things aligned. Did you consider that that was a sensible limit initially, 14 days?
Well, I think that was the element that was being bandied around of, well, not bandied around, sorry, that's not an appropriate phrase, that had been set out. And it felt, on the initial calculations, it could have been as high, I think, as nearly over £2 billion, could have been £3 billion if pretty much everybody in the country had undertaken that 14-day absence from work due to potential COVID symptoms. So this felt like a reasonable way to support small businesses in particular.
So far as you're aware, was there any consideration of long COVID, perhaps not at the start, but as the scheme developed, and the fact that somebody could be ill for longer than 14 days?
It certainly wasn't considered at the start because the concept of long COVID wasn't in anyone's mind, as far as I'm aware. I think later, I'm not sure that we did. What we did see was that take-up was quite a lot lower than perhaps had been anticipated. But I don't recall specifically, unless it's in my document somewhere, I apologise, but top of mind, I don't recall us revisiting this later.
Do you think, looking ahead, that in any future scheme, if there were to be a rebate scheme, that there should be consideration of sort of longer-term health consequences of a novel virus?
I think it slightly depends on what the nature of the restrictions are and what needs to be done to comply with the guidelines.
Now, you've touched on uptake, and I will come on to that in terms of uptake and explore with you generally why it might be that a scheme that was predicted to cost £2.2 billion in fact cost about £100 million. We'll come on to that. But before that, I just want to ask you about a document, INQ 000 609462, please. And the penultimate bullet there, the second bullet, DWP SOS. So that's you, Secretary of State. DWP SOS has asked HMT to consider extending the SSP rebate, both opening it to employers with more than 250 employees, so making it available to larger firms, and removing the restriction that employers can only claim up to 2 weeks of COVID-19 statutory sick pay per employee. You also need to make a decision about the future of the scheme. It currently has no end date. Now, we know that is in an email from the head of welfare strategy at the Treasury to HMT colleagues, and it's dated 21st of August 2020. So it's suggesting there that you were pushing for the scheme to be expanded. Do you recognise that you did think the scheme should be expanded to bigger businesses and for longer than 14 days?
I can't say I have individual recollection, but I'm not going to dispute what Treasury officials have sent either to the Chancellor or the Chief Secretary.
Are you aware of any discussions about expanding the scheme to bigger business and for longer?
I'm afraid I'd have to go back and looking in records. I've tried to do a comprehensive check of the documents I was given access to on a database, but trying to get through over nearly 700,000 documents was quite challenging.
What?
Sorry.
Don't apologise.
I'll happily take that one away and see what I can find. If that's helpful to Lady Hallett.
Thank you. So in terms of cost, it was, as I've said, predicted to cost 2.2 billion, ended up coming in at about 100 million. Do you consider that to some significant extent that underspend, if you like, was linked to the furlough scheme and the fact that a large number of employees were furloughed, so there were less workers actively in the workplace, therefore less who might become ill and need to claim?
Well, we did get a survey done of employers. I think that has been presented as evidence, and that gave us a sense of whether I think the majority of employers knew about it. Some have decided it wasn't worth the admin to get the refund. So there were a variety of reasons of why perhaps it wasn't taken up. And the other thing, I think the initial assumptions were of the high cost, and even the 2.2 billion, I think, midpoint, was that it was going to be a significant proportion of people needing to be away from work. I think there's an evolution also of work that not everybody was necessarily turning up in their office place, so they could. More and more people were able to start working from home. So I think there's a combination of factors that led to it, which meant there was a significantly smaller amount of money spent, or distributed, I should say.
Do you
I think it's also worth pointing out it's not technically a benefit from the government. It's a legal requirement on employers as well. So it wasn't for us to necessarily promote or push. It was us genuinely just trying to make sure that employers could get money to help them with the financial costs in helping their employees to comply.
And just picking up on that point, in terms of where this sits in the overall economic strategy of government, is your position then that this is really a scheme that was designed to support business and cushion their cost of paying the statutory required sick pay, as opposed to a scheme to put money into the pockets of vulnerable people or workers directly? It was about supporting business, essentially.
Well, I think, as I just said earlier, we'd already changed certain requirements through regulation changes on being eligible for sick pay. The extra rebate, it used to be the case that this was an automatic thing, and that policy had been disposed of, I think, about 7 or 8 years earlier. And this is one of the reasons why it sat within DWP. We used to administer it or have responsibility for it, given our broader authority on sick pay regulations. So I still think it was underlying that. But the reason for focusing on small employers was to alleviate some of the costs that they were bearing. So it wasn't trying to put money into small business owners' pockets. It was to help their employees comply with the guidelines.
Thank you. The scheme was due to end in September of 2021. So it had been extended and it was due to end. And the decision about whether it should be withdrawn, the inquiry understands, was a decision for yourself and the Chancellor in conjunction. Is that how you saw it?
Well, formally policy would be my responsibility, but if I'd wanted to extend it, I'd have had to apply to Treasury for more money.
Okay, so you held the policy, but the Treasury was funding it. So
they had the checkbook, yeah.
Yeah, so it didn't matter really. You might have wanted to pursue the policy, but if the Treasury said no, they would ultimately have a veto, I suppose.
I think that's theoretical. At that point, we were trying to bring a lot of the COVID support schemes to an end, and I didn't want to apply to extend it beyond where we were. Of course, the situation changed when the Omicron came along and we had a different variant and further restrictions were put. So we resurrected.
Picking up on that, in the summer of 2021, it's right, isn't it, that your officials were advising you that they thought the scheme should be extended further and should be extended until March of 2022?
Yes.
And if we could have up INQ 006537 6.4, the position is on, I think, page 2. Yes, at the bottom there. SOS has reviewed this submission and is not content with the recommendation to extend the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. Instead, the Secretary of State would like to close the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. She commented that HMRC should action this, but if necessary, we can help to prepare the SI for them. So that was your position. Your officials advised you that they thought it should be extended. You said that you thought it should end and effectively gave direction to that effect. Why did you think in the summer of 2021 that the scheme should end rather than accepting the advice of officials that it should be extended until 2022?
Well, I considered that there were a number of interventions that we were undertaking that were coming to an end naturally at that point. And I would have had to have made a further request for funding, and I didn't feel that we needed to do that. I can't really explain it much more than that. But it did get reopened when the situation needed it.
Yeah, in December of 2021.
Yeah, so we were able to resurrect it very straightforwardly.
Was that not, though, the fact that the virus might re-emerge and there might be higher incidences of infection in the winter, was that not what your officials have been warning you and suggesting why the scheme should be extended?
Well, I haven't got the actual submission to hand, but I have looked at this, obviously, in preparing for today, and one of the approaches that we were trying to make generally was have a consistency in how we worked with business. There's a variety of schemes right across government. And I appreciate my officials were trying to suggest things they thought were helpful. But I had already, to some extent, been part of the thinking of how to bring a lot of these schemes and we needed to get more into the recovery phase of post-COVID. But as the facts turned out, a new variant came along and we adjusted.
So your position in the summer was you were moving from emergency support into recovery.
Yep.
But
getting back to normal.
Yeah, but events then overtook that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we adjusted appropriately.
Yeah, thank you. Well, those are my questions about the statutory sick pay rebate scheme. I just want to ask you about one aspect of the next topic, which is the overall strategy for supporting the economically vulnerable or alleviating hardship. And it's to pick up really on some evidence that Will Quince gave to the inquiry yesterday. And I'd just like to ask you about it. He spoke about being part of what he described as a junior ministerial task force. You'll no doubt remember that evidence. And he spoke about that being an association of junior ministers across departments, across government, who would act together and then, as he put it, push their respective secretaries of state on issues. Were you aware that that task force existed? Did it have the status of a task force, or is that really overly formalising what was an ad hoc arrangement?
I really appreciated Will's evidence yesterday, but it was actually more formal than what he may have recalled. Quite early on, particularly with the shielded people, we needed to, and this is where DEFRA in particular leading, we needed to work out how we could get an MHCLG with Rob Jenrick as Secretary of State. We needed to work out how could we get food to people, how could we get stuff to people who were shielding. So there was a whole process about people who may not be considered who were shielded. And DWP actually helped in that we set up a big call centre went through a whole process in order to try and contact people. What happened, in effect, within a day or two of the formal announcement the Prime Minister made on 23rd of March about lockdown for everybody, Michael Gove convened a group of ministers, me, Secretaries of State, to think about the non-shielded vulnerable people and consideration of how we might need to help them. This all got worked up pretty quickly, in just a matter of days. And one of the conclusions from the meetings, I took Will along to a meeting with me because I knew that if we were going to get involved, I'd delegate to him. So basically, the recommendation, Michael took it away and I believe spoke to the Prime Minister, and they decided that they would just get a task force and that Victoria Prentice from DEFRA would lead it. So that was, I think, primarily about access to food. And then from that, there was an initial amount of money through DEFRA given to food distribution charities and the like. And that's when other things started to evolve on that particular element. A bit later, once we'd been through the summer, we had an issue about preparing for winter. And that's where I pulled together a package for the government, for the Prime Minister, which evolved into the winter grant and so on. So absolutely, Will was on there as a formal representative of DWP.
So your position then is there was a task force.
Yeah.
It was more formal than he recalls it to have been, in that it was stood up at Secretary of State level.
Well, Secretary of State came together to discuss the issue, and then the task force was stood up to be chaired very specifically by Victoria Prentice from DEFRA, who was a minister there. And that pulled in, I delegated to Will to be the DWP person.
Yeah. It had a specific initial remit, but having discharged that, it continued to meet and continued to be a forum where ministers across departments could meet. Is that your understanding?
I mean, it had a particular focus on food and essential supplies.
Yeah.
One of our challenges to some extent within DWP is that we were trying to focus on the shielded population, and that's where at times that's where we wanted to put our focus, because we'd taken on that responsibility of trying to contact, in the end, several million people to get them. Meanwhile, this other work continued, which was, I think, a good response for people with particularly in financial difficulty.
Was that sort of arrangement, junior ministers from different departments working together on a task force, unusual in government from your experience?
No, interministerial groups were quite a regular thing. Later on, I got the Prime Minister to agree that I could set up an interministerial group on tackling poverty. That's where I pulled in people from housing, education and so on to try and tackle cross-government issues.
And generally, have you found that cross-departmental working, that collaboration, is effective?
Yes, it can be, as long as people don't just turn up with a script. Actually come up with solutions. I mean, the formal process of actually getting to that task force was one of the ministerial groups, the General Purposes Public Services MIG. There were a number of ministerial implementation groups set up quite quickly in this COVID, but I know you've covered a lot of that already in earlier modules. Yeah. But the difference, probably just to be helpful in consideration, a cabinet committee is a delegated committee of the cabinet, so can make decisions which collectively holds everybody has collective responsibility powers. Interministerial groups tend to be not quite so formal and more issue-driven, and tend to go on for quite some time, but don't have to exist for the lifetime of a government. So it's tackling different things.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Can I move on then to the sixth broad subject area, and that is the decision to uplift universal credit and working tax credit by £20 a week. Now, obviously, covered this from the perspective of Mr. Quince yesterday, and I'm not going to just cover the same ground with you for the sake of it. Where things are not in issue, we'll take his evidence as a jumping-off point. But and that applies in particular to the origin of the uplift and the commission that was given to investigate it. Can I start with decision making? Is this again an example where the policy was your department's? It was a DWP policy, but it was a policy that had to be funded by the Treasury, hence the interest of the Chancellor alongside your oversight of policy.
That's right.
And implementation was for your department, on the ground delivery.
Yes.
Yeah. And in terms of the objective of the uplift, what do you say the core objectives of the uplift were?
It was to particularly help those people who were facing the most disparate adjustment to their incomes as a result of the pandemic. So those suffering could be suffering an economic shock. Principally people who were probably going into benefits for the first time.
And so it was not designed to be a general or to give general assistance with the cost of living or to all people in receipt of benefits, regardless of when they'd started to receive them.
That's right. The beauty of UC is it's a dynamic benefit. So for people already on UC, universal credit, sorry, if their income suddenly falls, then the system adjusts and will give them more as a consequence. So people who may have had, I'm bandying around a figure, £1,000 salary coming in, if that had fallen to say 400 or nothing, the amount of benefit would step up to help in that dynamic situation.
Yeah. Were you viewing this uplift as being a policy that was driven by a wider aim of alleviating poverty and assisting those most in need, or were you viewing it as a policy that was very much pandemic focused and offering targeted support to those who'd fallen into difficulties as a result of the pandemic?
I'd say it was pandemic focused. There was quite a lot of, even within our department, thinking through, can we adjust this, can we tweak that? We had to bear in mind, while UC was an online digital system and the old system would never have coped with what we went through, it still had limitations on stuff potentially needing to be reprogrammed to tweak at a fine level. Also, we were looking at, there was quite a difference in the standard allowance. Well, it was about £20 difference between that and statutory sick pay. So by trying to work out how you end up there, you've also can bear in mind that self-employed people, while other things developed, actually here was a way that if we put that £20 roughly to the UC standard allowance, that entry point would be similar in value. So there were a number of factors that got tossed around a bit. And then the other element is trying to make it simple, deliverable, straightforward. And that's where it eventually ended up.
Right. I want to ask you about a particular, this is quite a narrow topic, but was this a policy to help those who were newly claiming benefits that had to be applied to everybody because of the universal nature of universal credit? Or was it a policy that was designed to help new and existing claimants who'd suffered a drop in income?
The focus was on new people. We were told that trying to change the UC build to accommodate, trying to differentiate, was just end up taking quite a lot of programming and quite a lot of time. I think in a different way, Lady Hallett, one of my greater concerns thinking this through was for people coming into UC anyway, the way the system works, people may not have even been getting the amount of money they thought they would on their first UC payment. So we need to try and communicate elements of that. But just trying to re-engineer the system, the UC build, as it's called, was overcomplicated.
The way you put it in your statement to assist you, paragraph 184, is that the uplift for the standard allowance was considered as a simplistic approach targeted at helping people newly in receipt of benefits.
That's right.
And the only reason I'm focusing on this is that there would be people in receipt of universal credit who were in employment and may equally have suffered, therefore, a drop in their income as a result of losing that employment as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So was it not intended to help those people? Were they not the intended recipients, as opposed to those who had, for the first time, entered the benefit system? Do you see the distinction I'm drawing?
Somewhat. The UC payment to households would have adjusted, reflecting the drop in their own salary, because that's the dynamic nature of UC. So to some extent, they would have seen the benefits of being part of a dynamic benefit system already.
Because there would have been an automatic adjustment up to the ceiling of the benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Thank you. My lady, we need to take another short break this morning, or it's afternoon just now, but if we could.
Sorry, when should I return?
10 minutes, please.
20 past?
Thank you.
Just right.
Thank you, Melody. Can I move on to another topic under universal credit? That is the exclusion of legacy benefits from the uplift. So we know the uplift was applied to universal credit and to working tax credit, but not to other legacy benefits. But we've also heard evidence that your department did explore whether or not it was possible to apply the uplift to legacy benefits. So there was an exploration of whether that was feasible. Can I ask this? First of all, why do you say that legacy benefits were excluded from the uplift?
It goes back to people newly impacted and how to help kind of that element, aligning UC standard allowance with sick pay was in the thinking, and that was the primary reason. I expect there may be other suggestions that people have on why we didn't do it.
Well, I might test some of those, but your primary justification is that it was intended to support people who are newly unemployed. Newly unemployed people would all be receiving universal credit because that was the only benefit that new entrants could claim. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so, therefore, that's why it wasn't applied to legacy benefits. If that's the case, why were officials exploring whether it could be applied to legacy benefits? So in other words, if it was never meant to help those people, why spend the time seeing if you could apply it?
Well, I don't know what discussions happened amongst officials. I'm not surprised, knowing the education of my officials, that they will have tested to see what else could be doing. But all this is happening at quite a quick pace of back and forth.
Mr. Quince gave evidence yesterday about this, and his evidence was that his understanding was that the reason that the uplift wasn't applied to legacy benefits was operational. It was an operational block because of the IT system.
Well,
do you accept that?
What's accurate is that it would have been difficult to automate the existing legacy benefits system. That's definitely the case. It's an ancient system with a lot of interdependency, which is why the Secretary of State has to make effectively the decision on the regular uprating of benefits. I think it's happened in just the last few days, because it takes all this months to avoid the system basically crashing. In fact, you end up doing it on the basis that even when Parliament hasn't approved the rating, that you have to start the process. So it takes months on that legacy benefit system. That is accurate.
But do you accept that that was the reason that it wasn't applied, that operational block, or do you say it was never meant to apply for policy reasons?
For policy reasons, it was focused on new benefit claimants.
What about those who might be in receipt of job seekers allowance, so a legacy benefit, who might have therefore experienced a reduction in income, but were claiming a legacy benefit? Why should they be excluded, given the policy objective was to support those who'd had a drop in income because of the pandemic?
So the legacy benefits are strictly speaking the ones being replaced by universal credit, which is a process that is still to finally come to an end quite yet, as far as I'm aware. And then there are other benefits. There's the employment support allowance and the job seekers allowance based on a contributory. So you will have already had to have paid into national insurance to be eligible for that. Now, one of the big differences is that for universal credit, if you have capital savings, the UC element, the payment you might get, starts to change as soon as you have savings over £6,000. And if you have more than £16,000, you get nothing at all. That isn't the case for the contributory versions of JSA and DSA. So there's a variety of ways that people potentially could get help from the benefit system. But I wouldn't call that those two a legacy benefit. They're just a contributory. In fact, in DWP, they get called New Style.
If somebody had been a recipient of legacy benefits, but then moved over to universal credit, which was obviously what you were encouraging everybody to do, but if someone did do that, would they then be eligible for the uplift?
I wouldn't say that we were actively encouraging people to leave legacy benefits. That option has always been open to people on legacy benefits, but it's quite a different benefit system in terms of you get flat rate on the legacy, and then the universal credit is dynamic. And people who may have been anxious about moving to UC, they could have done it at any time, but they would only get transitional protection if they waited for the department to say, you must move to UC now. And we suspended all of that process pretty early on in COVID.
Yeah. My fault for probably mixing two concepts in one question, which is always bad advocacy. So I'll be more direct. If I was in receipt of legacy benefits and chose to move to universal credit, would I then get universal credit plus the uplift? Would the uplift apply?
You'd have got the new standard allowance, yes.
So with the uplift?
Yes.
So how would that be consistent with the policy objective of assisting people who had were new claimants to universal credit. So in other words, I've been on legacy benefits for a long time. My receipt of that benefit is nothing to do with the pandemic, but I move across and I then get the additional money that's meant to be supporting people who've lost their job.
Because to change the UC system to only have this uplift of £20 in the standard allowance apply to brand new benefits claimants would have required a lot of programming of the UC build. The priority was to keep the system stable. In fact, it was to expand the system, which is what a lot of the programmers had to spend a lot of their time expanding capacity so that the UC system in its own right wouldn't fall over. And it never did fall over. But that was dedicated effort of people doing that. So the Director General was pretty clear on when policy considerations were happening, is that we can't do everything you're asking. We can't just say it's only for people who are making a claim for the first time and so on. We just cannot cope with that. And we had to take their operational advice.
All right.
Same point you made earlier. The same point you made earlier about the uplift applying to basically to all or nothing.
Yeah, that's right.
If you wanted to deliver it at all, you had to do it in that way, because to try and target it would have collapsed the system.
Yeah.
But if you'd have been able to target it, then that is what you would have instructed officials to do.
I think in very early conversations that were going around our department, it was, how can we target some help to new people?
Can I move on to another design element of the uplift, and that is namely the benefit cap? We heard some evidence from Mr. Quince about the benefit cap yesterday. Do you agree that the benefit cap meant that the effectiveness of the uplift was limited for some claimants of universal credit?
Well, for new applicants, as long as they've been working already, there was a grace period of about 9 months. And that, for the newly impacted people, that was sufficient to say there wouldn't be a benefit cap. At the same time, all benefits, never mind the £20, was going up for the first time in 4 years, because we'd legislated to freeze benefits for 4 years. So I think they went up by 1.5%, something like that, 1.7%. So I think in our considerations, I know at some point in the summer I started asking for some advice. Could we perhaps extend the grace period and the like? But I felt that the majority of people who were new to benefits would not be impacted.
Well, certainly wouldn't be impacted for 9 months.
Yeah.
Though when it was introduced, this was a 12-month policy. In its first iteration, it was for the first year.
The £20, yes.
Yes.
I think that was a simplicity factor as well, in terms of having a whole year of one figure being changed here, and for tax credits, which was a Treasury policy.
But that does mean that even a new claimant would become caught by the benefit cap within that year. So after 9 months, doesn't it?
Potentially, if they were still unemployed. Of course, our hope was that we'd be trying to get the economy would recover post-COVID a lot earlier than it did.
So again, is this a sign that there was a hope, if not an expectation, that things would have returned to a more positive position before the 9 months had been reached?
Yes, I think that's right. I think I'm not trying to rewrite history, but I know that the Prime Minister at the time was hopeful that we would be through the significant impacts of COVID within that year.
And do you know why it was difficult or impossible to alter the benefit cap?
Well, there's a separate piece of legislation where the Secretary of State has to review every Parliament. In terms of extending the grace period within within our systems, when I'd asked for some advice about looking at this issue, I was told, there's no better way of saying this, computer says no. It would take a lot of rebuilding, and I don't particularly like computer says no approach to life. That was one of the reasons given that why it couldn't be adjusted in terms of extending the grace period.
Can I move on now to the extension? So we had the initial 12-month policy, and you've just explained why it was 12 months. It was, frankly, operationally easier to make it for 12 months, which I'm sure everybody understands. But then there came the discussion about the extension, and I really want to focus not on how the decision to extend was made, but more on policy design and development of the policy at the time of the extension. So far as you were concerned, the initial policy had been intended to assist those who were new entrants to benefits. You've told us that. That was the principal focus. By the time it came to the extension a year later, had the policy objectives from a DWP perspective widened? In other words, was it also now about generally alleviating poverty and supporting people who are at the lowest end of the income spectrum?
Well, I think in a variety of ways, having given people some more money, taking it away can be quite challenging. I mean, the decision wasn't made until, in the end, February of 2021 about whether we were extending it at all. So that took up a considerable amount of time in putting forward the proposal to actually happening. But during our considerations, clearly we hadn't come out of the full situation on COVID. So I saw it as part of my mission to try and extend.
Yeah. But when you were talking about the extension, you favoured, didn't you, an extension but also a modification of how the money was paid. So in other words, reducing the uplift to the standard allowance to £10 and then giving the other £10 focused on the child element of the benefit.
Well, we went through quite a significant amount of policy reiteration, looking at a variety of ways. I'm conscious that I don't want to give the impression I don't see people as statistics, far from it. But we also had a manifesto commitment of trying to reduce poverty. So I'd started this work on trying to tackle poverty quite clearly just by maths, having put extra money into a significant number of households. We had lifted hundreds of thousands of people technically out of poverty. And then by removing the uplift, we were going to put a lot of those people technically back into the definition of poverty. So I wanted to use a variety of ways, and benefits is one way, but there's all sorts of other costs of living challenges and the like, which is why we got the interministerial group going. Yes, I wanted to try and see what we could do to fulfil our manifesto commitment.
And so were you promoting the idea of changing the way in which the uplift was paid, splitting it between the standard and the child element to further those aims?
Yeah, I think there's an element here about we worked up multiple options, and I saw a way of splitting what would be considered a £20 uplift into considering what could we do perhaps to increase the child element at that point as a way of advocating how we might try and help tackle poverty. I think there were multiple options presented, but that was my suggestion.
I mean, the way Mr. Quince put it was essentially that the objective had been to help those newly in receipt of benefits as a result of the pandemic. But if the side effect of that was that everybody was assisted with their meeting the cost of living. That was a good thing. And one that should be banked if at all possible. Is that how you viewed it going forwards?
I think there's an element of that, but we also had, of course, a key focus on trying to help people get into work.
So part of an overall integrated
Yeah,
strategy as opposed
absolutely.
to just one thing viewed in isolation.
Yeah, and what could we do to help with the cost of childcare? What could we do? Aspects of housing. There's all sorts of issues we started looking at, but of course I had particular focus or responsibility for the level of benefits.
Yeah. At the time of the extension, there was still the situation that those receiving legacy benefits hadn't had an uplift. And we know from documents the inquiries received that there was a further investigation of whether it was possible to make payment to legacy benefits. And in particular, a one-off payment was an option that was discussed. Did you favour investigating whether there could be a lump sum payment to those on legacy benefits?
Well, advice from officials traditionally trying to avoid one-off payments, significant lump sums, and that's from history of evidence that sometimes this can cause issues. So by and large, strong advice from officials has always been to do it through the regular monthly payment that people would expect and manage.
Can I just pick up one very discrete topic about the digital divide, given the changes to the uplift and easements and the reduction of face-to-face meetings and so on and so forth. Are you aware of any consideration being given to how those who were unable to access digital forms and systems would make claims, and what support was given?
Oh, yes, that was very clear at the beginning when we went through various phases of considering our job centre opening and application. It was already the case that people could apply online for universal credit, but we were very aware that there'd be people who didn't have digital access, also struggled to make claims, that we needed to stay open for them. And that's why every job centre, while the door may have been closed to the majority of people, every job centre was open, in effect, to help vulnerable people. This was a really important part of what we needed to do. And there's a whole element of that being in the forefront of people's minds, for sure. Talking about divides, a bit later in 2022, when I'd managed to negotiate a cost of living payment, particularly who had inflation, we did do these sorts of one-off payments, but we didn't do it through the UC system, and we didn't do it through the legacy benefit system. I decided we would do it a different way to make sure everybody got money to help at that stage, even against potentially some of the advice about the issue of lump sums happening, which sometimes can have adverse effects.
Right. Can I move on to the end of the uplift? As the inquiry understands things, the uplift was put in place. It was then extended. Did you view the end of the uplift as being a positive decision, i.e. a positive decision to end it, or was it rather that it was a decision not to do anything to extend it? I didn't mean positive. I'll just make it clear, Lady Coffey, I didn't mean positive as in a good thing.
Right, okay.
I meant a
Right.
positive decision as in it needed positive action. So was it just that the legislation, the statutory instrument had expired, therefore it would end naturally, or was it that a positive policy decision had to be taken to end it? How were you looking at it?
Well, the decision got made in February. It was confirmed in a meeting, or we finalised the decision, I think it was the 26th of February, in a trilateral between myself, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. So that was it, decision had been made. It would go on for another 6 months. So then we had to operationalise that. And I'm not sure if I can add much more than that, really. But messages started to be sent to people saying that your £20, this specific element would no longer be part of your regular payment.
I suppose what I'm really getting at is that, and I think you may have answered it, that decision was made in February. There'd be a 6-month extension, and that was it. So that was the decision. There wasn't a further decision down the line that right now is stopping the uplift.
No,
It'd been taken.
that was it. 6 months.
And you had lobbied to maintain it permanently.
I had.
And was there any further attempt to persuade for a further extension? Or had the decision been taken and that was that, essentially?
I'm very conscious that there'd been a lot of lobbying in the run-up to the end of 2020, early 2021. But a decision had been made, and I do believe in collective responsibility. I think it's fair to say the economy we'd seen was needing to recover, and that we were moving not only on our plan for job scheme to try and get people into work. So, decision was made. There was a lot of lobbying in the autumn, that's for sure, as it was coming to an end. But
do you know whether any fresh equality impact assessment was carried out about the effect of removing the uplift?
I think because we weren't making any further changes, we didn't need to do a further equality impact assessment. One had already been done on the extensions.
So because that was the point at which the decision was effectively
That's
taken,
right.
that was the... I understand. Can I just pick up, if it's all right with you, for another 5 minutes, and I'll just deal with another topic, and then that leaves me with 2 short topics after the lunch break, if that's all right. And that is the fraud and error arising from easements. Now, we know that a number of easements were introduced for claims, and in many ways they were not a decision to introduce them, but they were essential because of the public health restrictions. Is that right?
Yes.
So, for example, you couldn't have face-to-face meetings in job centres because people weren't meeting face-to-face.
Indeed. We decided that it wasn't sufficiently essential that people had to go in to do claimant commitments and the like. So we, particularly at the very start, we put in a considerable number of easements in place.
And were you concerned at the time about the increased risk of fraud and error that might arise from those easements?
Yes, I was.
Yeah.
We had no doubt that people would try and defraud, sadly, both in a sophisticated, coordinated way or other ways. We had gone through a process, I think before I was Secretary of State, on how face-to-face checks were important, but also we had to, I think, get the balance right of getting money out the door, but then following up as quickly as we could to get some of the extra checks that were needed. But yes, I was concerned. I was concerned throughout that whole time that I was there at DWP about the challenges of fraud and what we needed to do about our easements.
Accepting, as you did, the advice that you had to make the easements because of conditions, we heard from Mr. Quince yesterday, and we looked at an email he sent where he was expressing surprise and or annoyance, really, that the department wasn't making retrospective checks and getting on with the process of trying to weed out instances of fraud and error. Did you share that concern that there wasn't enough being done, those easements being accepted, to make what checks could be made and to pursue recovery?
Well, we put in place initially kind of almost, and this was in discussion actually as well with Treasury going back to Spending Review 2015, Treasury had put in a variety of conditions about how some of this was being done. So in late April, I asked for a calendar of easements so we could get into some systematic way of how we could be reviewing and considering aspects of fraud and what learning was going on at the time. The department started to learn quite quickly how to improve some of their fraud avoidance. They'd already done pretty good, reasonable job, but for example, they started to use things like they modified their telephony questions when they were phoning people where we hadn't got evidence of their identity or some of the issues. I think a tool called Searchlight was opened up to them, which was used in mainly local government, I think it was, trying to check did they really live where they said they did, or but this had to evolve and also opened up. We had initially used something called Verify, which was run by the Cabinet Office, and at one point it basically fell over because Vodafone's pipeline for the number of calls wasn't big enough for the number of people trying to do their claims. So we did a variety of ways of trying to manage that at the start. But I did keep wanting to push back on, in particular, things like advances of benefits that we needed to reintroduce face-to-face as quickly as possible in order to achieve that. Now, I do recall at the time the department pushed back to basically say, well, we need to focus on claimant commitments and these other things. And by the way, we think our level of fraud has now fallen considerably. But it was certainly in my mind, this is taxpayers' money for which I was responsible, and if there was money going to people who shouldn't have it, that was not a good thing. And so keeping a focus on fraud was something that we as ministers in particular, I think, pushed throughout our whole time. And then evolving a new fraud strategy with some of the learnings from the pandemic.
Do you think the officials in the department were sufficiently focused on that fraud and error? Did you feel you were having to push this along, otherwise nothing would have been done?
I think it would be unkind to say nothing could be done. But I think ministers did really push hard on this. I mean, there were some great successes. I think one weekend quite early on, there was a sophisticated, coordinated attempt. And by blocking that, we saved about £1 billion. Now, that's good. There were other things that were starting to be picked up quite quickly. People all of a sudden moving in COVID and their rent going up considerably, and really checking and then doing some analysis, like there'd be 10 families all of a sudden claiming housing support for that address. So stuff was happening, but I think it's fair to say there was a reluctance to reintroduce some of the face-to-face aspects. But in a different way, this gave the department an opportunity to rapidly go into perhaps more sophisticated ways. I think they called it IRIS, but their risk and intelligence. So we had different levels of factors. There was another issue that when you were trying to do interviews about fraud, they would have to come into the job centre, and there were some limitations about that. So there was a mixture of things going on, but I think it's fair to say ministers did keep pushing and nagging, frankly, about trying to tackle some of these issues.
Thank you very much. Well, I wonder if that's a helpful moment to take
Certainly, I shall return at 1:55.
Thank you.
All right.